Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural episode of Ratio at Rutgers, the unofficial or official, I'm actually not really sure on this one, podcast of Ratio Christi at Rutgers University. I'm your host, the unrevered, irreverent Reverend Matthew J. Therio. With me is my co-host with the Holy Ghost, the gregarious Gregory Manichek, and the slightly saintly, oh so sinful Sid Ceballos.
I don't like that introduction.
Okay, we will work on that one. I picked it because it was alliterative, and all the guests we're going to have on the show, we're going to have an introduction like that. We'll tweak yours. First thing I want to do, since our listeners don't really know who we are, let's go around and kind of introduce ourselves, give a little background. As for me, I'm a graduate of Concordia University, Wisconsin, with a degree in philosophy and ancient languages, which includes the biblical Koine Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, although I was always terrible at Hebrew. I almost don't count that one even. While I was there, I was actually the head of the radio. I managed the radio station. I had a few radio shows, but I haven't done anything like that in years. So actually, Greg is our producer because of that. He's the tech wizard putting this whole show together. After college, I went on to seminary for about a year and a half. I was in the MDiv program, planning on becoming a minister. Obviously, that didn't happen. Well, actually, not obvious. Like, I just did introduce myself as a reverend. That's a joke, by the way. Not really a reverend. This right here is about as close to having a ministry as I have these days. You know, working with Ratio Christi, doing the translation club, the church history club. This is kind of where I see, you know, God having called me, my vocation. I have a career that's not my vocation, completely unrelated to anything in the church. But so I think that's sufficient background for me. Greg, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Matt. I wouldn't call myself a tech wizard. I'm just kind of learning this myself. But anyway, I'm Greg Matichak. I'm currently the secretary for Ratio Christi at Rutgers. I'm also an undergrad here at Rutgers. I've studied now 2 semesters of modern Hebrew, which has helped a little to ancient Hebrew because the interface seems pretty good, since it was developed only about a century ago out of ancient Hebrew. And now I'm beginning to study some Attic and Koine Greek. I'm hoping to be under the tutelage of Mr. Matthew Therio, who has much more experience in that than I do. And I'm currently an English major studying our own language as well as these others.
I'll qualify that. A lot of experience, but a lot of that's atrophied. So this is going to be a relearning experience for me, and I try to work those muscles of translation again. We'll get into that later on in the show. Sid, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Well, I am a philosophy major here at Rutgers. I'm extremely passionate about the Catholic faith specifically, and interested in other ancient languages, but have not yet gotten my study begun on that yet.
So it actually brings up a good point. I guess we hadn't really talked about our faith background. In case it wasn't obvious to listeners, Concordia, Wisconsin is a Lutheran institution. I grew up in the Lutheran Church. That's where a lot of my theological background and even current day beliefs, you know, still stem from, especially justification, things like that. I have been moving my beliefs into, I hate to say unorthodox, because I believe I really am within orthodoxy, but a lot of my beliefs are based just as much in scripture as they are in natural theology, and that informs so much of how I interpret scripture. And we'll get into that when we talk about the principles of biblical translation and hermeneutics later. So, Greg, why don't you tell the listeners about your faith?
Right, so I think I could say pretty safely that all of our beliefs have been changing over the last about a year.
And that's due to exploration within Ratio Christi and intellectual honesty and all that. So it's moving towards truth, hopefully.
Of course, yeah. Obviously, we're shifting beliefs, but also they're kind of blossoming as we learn more about our own backgrounds and then the backgrounds of others. For instance, I had a Protestant upbringing, but became more interested in researching Catholic theology during high school and into college. And now I'm kind of shifting back into researching more Protestant theology to see both the history of it and the teachings of it.
And Sid already mentioned, his strong Catholic faith. Any more you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I do consider Christianity to only have the option of being Orthodox or Catholic, considering my ecclesiology. But I have been doubting some of the foundational assumptions of Christianity, such as a personal relationship with God, and Jesus as God. But other than that, I think it's just a place where I have to do a little bit more research, and hopefully I'll get over that hump.
Yeah, and that is one of the things Ratio Christi, I think the cornerstone of Ratio Christi, doing research into truth, challenging assumptions, being, like I said, intellectually honest, not just blind faith, but faith based on reason, and looking at what are the reasons for the faith, what are the claims made by the faith, and do they hold up to scrutiny and reason. So we definitely welcome all types of questioning. One of the things I love most about Ratio Christi is it's not just Christians in the group at all. We have atheists, we have Muslims that are active and vocal members of the group.
Yeah, and just the other day it was brought up, what exactly is the mission of Ratio Christi? We were asked by a new attendee at our first meeting of the semester, and it was an interesting question to kind of talk amongst ourselves briefly. And it seems to be not just so much defending Orthodox Christianity, but really figuring out what is the core Christianity that at least most of us can agree on or distinguish definitely is Christian, as opposed to something else like Judaism or Islam or kind of Gnosticism and other things. And that really is a nice part, especially since we all have different backgrounds, and figuring out what we can agree on as well as with others.
Exactly. And part of those questions, kind of spilled over into a new group that we started as an offshoot of Ratio Christi, our church history club that I mentioned, because Ratio Christi, so much of it is apologetic. It's defending the Christian faith, on the basis of reason against other truth claims. And these were the church history club was a way of exploring, okay, well, what is the Christian faith historically, and how did we arrive at the faith we have today?
Right, and Church History Club, we should mention, is an offshoot of Ratio Christi. We've been hosting occasional meetings or sessions of it since the spring this year, 2014, and it's been more focused on church history, of course. It's not the core of Ratio Christi.
No, by no means. But I do like the fact that we are spreading out into new areas, church history, biblical translation, all these different things, even the podcast, in fact, I didn't do this purposely, when I was founding Church History Club, when I was saying, we got to have a Bible study that's based on translation. But if you take these four things, Ratio Christi meetings themselves, the translation club, Church History Club, the podcast, those four break off neatly into the four pillars of theology. At the beginning you have exegetical theology, reading the text. And I would say that conforms to Translation Club. Then you have systematic theology, where you take what you have and you systematize it into one corpus of doctrine, one body of doctrine that's coherent and self-consistent. And I would say that's kind of what Ratio Christi does. Then you have historical theology, and obviously that conforms to Church History Club, a survey of what have people believed in the faith before we came here. How do we derive at it? And then the fourth pillar is practical theology, going out and spreading the word, and you don't spread it much further than the whole internet and the whole world. And I know not the whole world's listening to this, but hopefully we get some viewership or listenership up.
Who knows, maybe more than 10 people even.
So the next thing I want to do is actually give a breakdown of the segments that are going to be occurring on the show in every episode. So we have our introduction, and it'll be briefer in future segments. The next thing we're going to do is Ratio in Review, and we're going to take whatever the topic was at Ratio Christi that week and just give a summary of what the arguments were and where we personally fall in those arguments. What stance we took and why we took it. The next thing we're always going to do is a segment I call glossolalia, which, if you know, that is the word for speaking in tongues, the technical term for it. And that refers to our translation club. Now, this is going to be actually our first translation club also. We've never had a meeting before, but in the future, translation club is going to be its own thing, not part of the podcast. And we're just going to offer up what our translation was for the week. And the third segment is going to be alternating. On weeks that we have the Ecumenical Council, that is Church History Club, we're going to be talking about whatever we talked about at the council. Again, summarize the arguments, state our positions. But on every other week, we're going to do a segment I call Christ and Culture and Dialogue. And this is named after my mentor's book, Christ and Culture and Dialogue, by Angus Minuje, who is actually writing about the famous tome by H. Richard Niebuhr, Christ and Culture. Nothing to do with either of those books. We're just going to be taking something from culture and analyzing the Christology in it. Some of the things that we have planned are Tolkien's Legendarium, including Lord of the Rings and everything else there. The Superman franchise and its 75-year history. I'm really excited about that one, The Matrix, of course, which I know Kristen said she never had seen. I don't know about you guys. So
I've seen it. I'm not sure. Have you seen it, Sin?
The Matrix?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, so yeah, that's the one we'll definitely have to watch. Just got the Blu-rays in recently, so excited about that.
I know I'm subhuman for doing so, but I have not seen The Matrix.
So those are going to be our segments. Let's start off with Ratio and Review. And I'm not going to be talking a lot in this segment since I had to leave early for work, and I'm not even going to make next week. So you guys, what was the meeting about? What was the topic?
Right, so we just had a nice kind of introductory meeting, kind of introduce the reason for apologetics, and is apologetics reasonable? Is there a reason for your faith, or can you both question your faith and give a reason for it, or is it just kind of something you blindly follow? And of course we're going to agree with the former, that yes, you should have a reason to have your faith, not just believe what you know ain't so, as Mark Twain put it. And this started off basically, just one thing is pertaining to Christianity we wanted to mention, is that specifically to Christianity, God is the source of reason, at least that's what we claim. He is perfectly true and the source of all truth. And so, if Christianity is to claim this, obviously it has to be reasonable, and there has to be some ability to show truth in it, not just kind of assume things or pick whatever is more comfortable for our lifestyles. It makes truth claims, which we have to give reasons for and arguments for why one should believe them, obviously. So, the first thing that we talked about, I think, was, is there an objective truth in an atheistic worldview as compared to a theistic worldview, which you can rely on for intelligibility, to trust your own reason, for things like that. And one thing that came up, a big reason, was a naturalistic worldview, and is there any plausibility to it? This is a big part of the argument from reason, which claims that except in a theistic worldview, either in a naturalistic worldview or in an atheistic worldview, well, both are atheistic, but
well, you can have a naturalistic worldview that's not atheistic. Pantheism would be a religious worldview that's still naturalistic.
I see.
Materialism would be what you're talking about, where it's atheistic by definition.
Right, that was one
that was a distinction you made.
Yeah, I made the distinction, but it wasn't really a problem in the discussion. Now, unlike most proponents for the argument from reason, I do give a little credence to naturalism as far as when it comes to trusting our reason and being sure that there's intelligibility in the universe that we can understand. And the reason I give this credence is because while in a naturalistic universe there is no intentional design, perhaps, there could still be, if we are to believe that we can understand this universe, design or intelligibility, not design, by chance, and that while we are not designed to understand these things, as parts of the universe, a universe that is intelligible, we can obviously reflect on the universe. In a sense, the universe admires itself.
Intelligence that's emergent, if not designed.
Right.
And I do actually believe that mind can be epiphenomenal, deriving strictly from brain states. But having consciousness, sentience, intelligence, those are different claims than having reason. And I think Lewis points this out very well in his first 3 chapters of the book Miracles, where he states that if the materialistic worldview is true, then there's no reason to suppose that the random neurons firing in your brain, which are the results of particles bumping into each other, are producing any necessary truths. There's a disconnect between truth, which is immaterial, and simply the random behavior of matter. And that gulf, that divide, doesn't seem to be bridged anywhere in the materialistic worldview.
In a materialistic worldview, but a naturalist view, I think we made the distinction that in a naturalist worldview, that there are metaphysical principles and things existing that 1 and 1 make 2, not just because physical objects, if you put one and another together, you get 2 objects, but that 1 and 1 is 2 no matter what, even detached from material objects. I think is that the distinction between naturalism and materialism, or am I wrong?
That is a distinction, and You're right. Platonism, therefore, would be naturalistic. Plato, his monad was never defined as God. There was a word for God in the Greek language. He never used it to describe the one. And yet, that's exactly, what he was saying. Things like numbers could have reality, a higher reality than the material world, but still the principle behind the material world.
Right, and the monad being, for those unfamiliar, Matthew, you probably could explain this better than I do, you having studied Plato extensively and calling yourself a
Christian Platonist.
Yes.
The monad, means the one, the first thing, the principle, the source of everything else. The Plotinus called it, both being and non-being. So simple, so primal that nothing else could be said about it.
Now, he's not to be confused with a Platonic Christian.
That's right. Sid's girlfriend's mother tried to set me up on a blind date one time, and she told the girl that I was a Platonic Christian. And I'm like, no, I don't want to just be friends with Jesus.
Right. And so, getting back to our discussion of faith and reason, I think one point that came up as far as a big reason to believe Christianity is, as C.S. Lewis put it, Christianity is myth made history, at least in the instance of Christ. If we go back to the Old Testament, miracles became a big part of the discussion, and people were citing things like the pillars of fire or the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus. And whether or not these are completely myth or somewhat myth and somewhat historical, it's very hard to tell. As C.S. Lewis, I kind of know this. He basically made the claim that as you gradually go back in time from Christ, the separation of myth and history becomes harder to distinguish.
Exactly.
However, the specific reason for Christianity, I imagine, is a little harder in Judaism. But Christianity, its miracles are historical and attested to in the Gospels. We have strong reason to believe that these Gospels not only were solid testimony, but that they survived. Not necessarily so much change, although there were a few additions, but that their central message at the least, was intact, and thus we can rely that at least those writing them down really believed what they saw, being that most of them are martyrs, all except for John the Apostle.
True. And another point to make there is the fact that genre plays a role in how we interpret Scripture. The Old Testament, especially Genesis, may have been written in different genres that were familiar to Near Eastern peoples at the time, which were not as concerned with history. The Gospels seem to be a subset of the biographical genre, And those do seem to be slightly more concerned with preserving historical truth. Now, they'll still, I won't say embellish those truths, but they'll still arrange and order those truths for narrative significance. That's why in the Synoptics, Jesus dies, the day after Passover begins, whereas John, he dies on the day of Passover. But at the same time, no one is doubting the fact that when they say Jesus rose from the dead, they're not saying mythically he rose from the dead. They're saying this is a historical fact. And Paul makes the argument, in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, your faith is in vain. The resurrection is the foundation of Christianity, so no one is doubting the historicity of that at all.
Well, everyone who
no one here at
is a
Ratio
Christian,
Christi. Yeah.
Right.
None of the three of us in this discussion. I should have clarified that.
No, we're good on that.
Unfortunately, there have been a couple of Christian movements that have been saying, oh, this is a type of metaphorical resurrection, that his teachings went on living. Well, these people just simply are so far off orthodoxy that it pains me, and it should pain every other Christian out there. Also, going off the miracles things, something that I brought up was that we don't only have to look at the miracles from all the way in the past and say, oh, those happened and give like some historical reasons for it. We could also bring out miracles that are happening today. There is, in the Catholic Church, this miracle is called the miracle of Saint Januarius, Januarius. And what happens is that every single day, every single feast day of the saint, there's a Eucharist that has blood on it, and it, instead of coagulating, it actually liquefies every feast day. Still, obviously miraculous. We don't know why it does that. Another one would be a statue in Bolivia of the head of Christ that they actually put through an MRI to make sure no inner machinations of it, would appear. It was bleeding, just on the statue, it was just bleeding. When they took samples of its blood, they discovered that it was that it had scabs from heart muscle, and they gave it to multiple atheist doctors to, determine, hey, what is this? And they were just like, yeah, this is just the blood of. Well, first off, they couldn't even map out the human genome from these blood samples, and they also discovered that it was heart tissue. Not only was it heart tissue, it was traumatized heart tissue, exactly what you would have expected from this type of blood.
Why? Well, regardless of what we would expect, these miracles, interesting as they are, and whatever happens from their investigations, whatever comes out of it, these are certainly not as important to Christianity as the resurrection, the incarnation of Christ. These may be small reasons to believe or to give some additional faith, but the resurrection certainly is the most important thing upon which Christianity hinges, as you pointed out.
Right. You can't be a Christian and not believe in the resurrection or the incarnation. But as for me, and many Protestants like me, we are more dubious about the claims of modern-day miracles. And certainly any specific instance. We'll treat them as anecdotal evidence, but not genuine evidence that you're compelled to believe. If it gives you faith, well, I was about to say if it gives you faith, that's all the better. But no, if it's true and gives you faith, that's good. But if it's false and gives you false faith, that's not good. We want a reasoned faith. So yeah, I'm glad I caught myself on that one.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same thing. You don't want faith for the wrong reasons.
Exactly. So yeah, the question of modern day miracles is one definitely that there's debate on, and definitely cause for further investigation in the future. Maybe even by Ratio Christi at one of our meetings. But I know something came up at the meeting after I left, and you were talking to me a little bit about it earlier, and that's atheistic morality. Did you have anything to say on that, Sid?
Well, I mean, I just want to first clarify. As it says in John 10:38, but if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father. So, I mean, miracles are always second place to just, Christ. And yes, the resurrection is a crux of Christianity, but I was just using these other miracles to point out that we don't only have to look at what might be even harder to prove, more historical miracles than miracles that are happening today. Another one would just be the incorruptible saints, and you can look those up. But going back to atheistic morality, so this was... Usually Christians like to make an argument for morality, saying that, okay, well, they ask a question such as, is rape bad? And usually the atheist will say, yeah, it's bad. And then you tell them, okay, are there any exceptions? No, there's not exceptions. It's always bad. All right, so fine. What makes it always bad? Well, then we like to conclude, well, there is this law that derives from something transcendental, which could be God. Well, the atheist kind of just, I believe, is just being intellectually dishonest and doesn't realize that the argument makes absolutely no sense to him. What he should say is that, well, no, it's not always bad. If enough people decide that it is bad and they want to enter into a social contract and say, rape is bad, and if you do it, you'll get caught and punished. Well, that's their jurisdiction. And the only reason I'm saying this, it's not an attack on atheism, but it's more an analysis on atheism, where if the only form of morality is, well, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, well, I don't like anyone stabbing my back, so I won't stab yours. And what we're going to find is that through a social contract theory, possibly, if you can get away with it, then there's no reason why you shouldn't do it. It's only a social contract. Really, what it does is it promotes the more clever people, more crafty people, to really just take advantage of the other less conniving people.
And I'm not sure that atheists would disagree. I used to attend the Atheist Student Alliance last year a lot more often. I want to get back into it this year as well here at Rutgers. And we talked about the issue of morality and is there a source of objective morality. And after long discussion in which they were claiming, yes, you can have objective morality in atheism, ultimately it came down to them saying, actually, yeah, morality, ethics, laws, these are all social constructs that people are creating. And when you really get down to it, the only thing that really matters is power. The power to exert your will over another person's will. And if you are able to, good for you. There's nothing to stop you. There's no reason not to. It's all self-interest.
Yeah, and examining these implications of an atheistic worldview without an objective morality, of course, is interesting in itself and probably should be a forewarning to maybe your personal decisions, although obviously you should be motivated by truth. And that is the real question, is it true? And that's what we're more dedicated to solving, although these are things worth noting.
Exactly, because if atheism is true, the fact that it doesn't have a foundation for morality doesn't make it any less true.
It could just be that everything to us is just terrible. I introduced this term at Ratio Christi the other day. It's called Christian inception. That we've been through so many generations of Christianity, of this instilled morality of, something always watching over us, that even the atheist can't hide from it. That sometimes the atheist is actually more virtuous in some respects for no reason at all. So I don't get it, because I explained this type of reasoning, that that they had absolutely no reason to be virtuous, and again, not an attack on its truth, but more an attack on its practical side. That fortunately for them, we have been brought up in a society filled, for the most part, with Christians that will adhere to more virtuous practices. And honestly, if this whole God thing isn't true, well, we're suckers. And they're probably the ones that have the actual life.
Paul said as much, actually. If the resurrection is true, we are to be pitied above all men. And I would actually say that, the claim of truth over the claim of morality is the reason that I don't buy the argument from morality for the existence of God. And we're going to be talking about those arguments for the existence of God in the coming weeks at Ratio Christi. I know we had proposed to do 6 or 7 different arguments. I don't think that we're going to get to all of them this fall semester. But the classical arguments for the existence of God, and then we'll move on, are the ontological argument, obviously, the teleological, the cosmological, the argument from reason, the argument from morality, the argument from beauty, and there's the 7th one that I'm calling the argument from nothingness. It's not a classical argument at all, but it's, I think, the strongest evidence for the existence of God. And on a future podcast, I really want to get into that. I know I've shared it with Greg before, and it's combining these topics of Christianity and atheism in a novel way, I think.
It is a pretty great argument. It is.
So that's just a tease for future episodes right there. Is there anything else to say about Ratio Christi last week, or do we want to move on?
Perhaps we'll just mention that we will be getting to the argument from beauty later this month, actually.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, we'll be having some artist who from NYU, I think, coming in to discuss it. I'm not really familiar with anything he's done, but
okay.
At least he'll have more experience than us in terms of aesthetics and art appreciation,
right.
I guess.
And I know our vice president, Andrea, she's been writing a lot of articles on aesthetics and philosophy lately. Maybe we should get her as a guest on the show when we do that episode.
That sounds like a good idea. So yeah, maybe now's a good time to move on.
Okay, our second segment is, as I said, glossolalia, speaking in tongues. And right now, we're just going to get into our goals for what we want Translation Club to be, since we haven't translated anything. When we do, we're going to be starting with, John chapter 1. And you can see right here the list of things to translate. And it's a really ambitious list. Nearly 100 verses, and if we do one verse a week, it's going to take us about 2 years to even get those done. But the whole reason I founded this club is, I want us to get a greater appreciation of reading texts in their original language and a greater understanding of the process of translation. When I was studying translation in all these languages at seminary and undergrad, an analogy was made, and it stuck with me because I think it's so appropriate. Reading the Bible in English is sort of like watching a football game on a black and white TV. Now, and I'm talking an old CRT, low resolution. You're going to see every play. You're going to know how many yards, the team went. You're going to know what the score is. You're going to know who won. You're going to get all of the information. But reading the original language, that's like actually being there at the game or watching on a high definition, color TV, 4K. You're seeing so much more. You're getting such a better picture, such a better understanding of what is going on. That's if you have a good understanding of the languages. Sometimes, if you're still struggling, and that's where we're going to be at first. Reading in the original language isn't always going to help, but hopefully we can really dig into like each and every word and get as much out of it as we can. And the other goal that we have for this year, it's not just self-edification. I actually want us to produce something. And I want us to produce an abridged interlinear diatessaron from the Gracia Novum Testamentium, the Vulgate, and our own original English translation. And I know there's a lot of polysyllabic words in there, so we're going to break those down right now and get into just exactly what that means. Well, let's start with the interlinear. We were talking about this earlier. You brought up the Rosetta Stone. That's not quite what an interlinear text is. Interlinear is where it has one line from each of the languages. So what we're going to make, our abridged New Testament, our abridged Diatessaron, is going to have a line from the Greek. It's going to have a line from the Latin and a line from the English. And so when you're reading this, you can read it back and forth in all three of the languages and see how they're playing around with each other. And it's a really great tool to have if you're studying the languages or trying to refresh yourself. A diatessaron, that's not a word you hear a lot these days. It is a harmony of the Gospels. Well, all four of the Gospels specifically. You can see that in the root of the word. Dia, the Greek prefix from, through, and then tesser, meaning four, from the four. And the very first Diatessaron is as old as the 2nd century. They were trying to take all four of the authoritative Gospels and put them into one coherent narrative of the life of Christ. And it's actually part of the evidence we have that the four Gospels, were the only authoritative Gospels from an early date.
Interesting.
Okay. So let's get into the text that we're going to be working with as we're making this interlinear Diatessaron. The first one I have on our list is the Vulgate. And I'm sure you guys are very familiar, due to your Catholic background, with the Vulgate. It's Jerome's Latin translation. Was not the first Latin translation, but it was the definitive one, and almost still is in many ways. It's the one that the Catholic Church still uses as their official. Is it not?
I'm not sure.
I'm not entirely sure.
I know up and through Vatican II, it was the standard, correct? I could be wrong. I don't know Catholicism that well.
I'm not sure if they actually updated the Latin one or if they did not. I'm not entirely sure on that, but I will get back to you on that. But
the Vulgate is probably the single most significant translation of the Bible into any language in all of history. That much I can say.
It was definitely in use for definitely over 1,000 years, but I'm not sure if it's still in use today. Another thing that a lot of people don't know about Jerome is that he actually coined the term apocrypha. A lot of people think that Protestants did that, but nope, it was actually Jerome. He had studied with Jewish scholars, much like Luther did at the beginning, and didn't think the deuterocanonical books were scriptural. Later on in his life, he recanted that belief and believed them to be fully scripture, but he did coin the term apocrypha.
And I assume that his basis for believing that was the fact that the deuterocanonical books, the apocryphal books, are originally written in Greek and not Hebrew. That was kind of the differentiating point. Now, I know there's some evidence that some of the apocrypha, they do think there are Hebrew texts for nowadays, but...
Like Tobit?
Right, but Luther's day and Jerome's day, their understanding was that it was originally in Greek, correct?
Not entirely sure about that. So, not entirely sure.
Okay, that's something to investigate further. Next, we're going to talk about the Greek that we're going to be looking into, and the Greek is actually a little bit more complicated. Right now, the standard for scholars is the Gracia Novum Testamentium, which is also known as the Nestle-Aland. But this isn't any one particular Greek text. This isn't one manuscript. The Greek that we get today comes from many different manuscripts of the New Testament. The two most significant ones I want to talk about briefly. They're part of the four great uncials. Don't worry about that. It just refers to the style of text. But the two most significant are Codex Vaticanus, which is also known as B, and Codex Sinaiticus, also known as Aleph. And Vaticanus, we've had this since the 15th century, and it is probably the oldest full Greek Bible that we have. And the entire thing, the Septuagint and the New Testament in Greek, start to finish. And then Sinaiticus, as you can tell from the name, was discovered at Sinai. This was much later in the 19th century. But it's a really interesting story. The guy that found it at this monastery, the monastery of St. Catherine's at the foot of Mount Sinai, made the claim, and whether it's true or not, historians debate, that there were pages of it just in the waste paper basket, ready to be burned as, waste. Like they were about to throw out the most significant, Greek Bible in the world, probably. And scholars think that both of these, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, are part of the 50 Bibles that Constantine himself commissioned, that Eusebius mentions in Historia Ecclesia.
So these are from the 4th century, actually?
Yep.
No, they were discovered, obviously.
They were discovered much later, but we know both of them to be early 4th century manuscripts.
Wow, so that was pretty close to the time when I guess they already decided at Laodicea about what they were going to keep in the Bible, even though they didn't officially claim it as canon and a closed canon.
Right, there's debate about that because you're referring to Canon 60 of the Council of Laodicea, which was not a ecumenical council, it was a regional one, and still historians think that Canon 60 may have been thrown in afterwards, may not have actually been part of the official discussions at Laodicea.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we're definitely actually at the next Church History Club meeting. We're switching away from ecclesiology and getting into the formation of Scripture.
And by no means, at Laodicea did they have the 27 books of the New Testament put together. The first time that happens would be in the Council of Rome in 380 AD. But yeah, even if people think that the Council of Laodicea decided on Scripture, it would have only had 20 of the 27 books. So,
and you would say that officially, the canon was put together, and this is off topic a little bit, but you would say at Trent, correct?
I wouldn't say at Trent. I would say at Trent it was deemed as authoritative by an ecumenical council, considering councils respond to heresies, and the canon was being disputed by Luther, and we kind of shut him down and said, no, the canon is this, and it's authoritative, period. So that's what we did at Trent. But even before Luther's time, it was decided from the point of maybe that late 4th century, people were using the same canon all throughout.
Okay, and that's definitely a discussion for another day, because I can speak for hours and hours on the formation of the canon, and we obviously have some disagreement there. But let's get back to how we got our current Greek translation. Now, this next thing I have on here, the Textus Receptus, isn't directly influential of the Grasse Novo Testamentium. However, if you're talking about Greek Bibles, you have to mention it. It is so influential. It's the first one that's ever put to the printed page, and it's compiled by Erasmus, the great humanist that was so influential on Luther and all the other reformers. His Textus Receptus is the basis for the King James translation, for Wycliffe's English translation, for Luther's translation of the German Bible. All of them were based off of the Greek of the Textus Receptus. And so I'd actually be interested in sometimes going away from the Nestle Aland and looking at Erasmus's text and translating from that. If we want to just, get a different opinion on what the manuscripts might have said. Because that's the thing to point out. The Nestle Aland, in its preface to the 20th edition, which is what we'll be using, makes it very clear. They're not trying to recreate the original autographs of the apostles. It's impossible. No one has those. They're just saying, we're trying to recreate the earliest manuscripts from which all other manuscripts are derived. And those might not be the ones actually written by the apostles themselves. So we can never fully construct the New Testament as it was written. But we have very, very good evidence that the manuscripts we do have preserve everything, in there. Yeah, there's going to be scribal errors. There's going to be spelling mistakes. There's going to be words in different places. But for the most part, the theology is preserved. The history is preserved. The meaning of the text is, for the most part, preserved. And we'll get into exceptions there later on. Let's talk about, well, I guess we're talking about translation right now, the act of translation.
Let's move on to hermeneutics.
Yeah, we've talked about translation. Let's move on to hermeneutics. It's the study or theory or the methodical interpretation of a text, and especially a religious text. It began originally just talking about the Bible. How do we interpret the Bible? And we were talking about the etymology of hermeneutics the other night. Do you recall what I said?
Yeah, you thought it was related to Hermes.
Well, not just me, scholars.
Oh,
really? Well, no, I originally assumed it was. You're right.
Oh, shoot. I can't remember exactly what you discovered.
Yes. What I discovered was that, yes, they do think it is in part from Hermes, who is the Greek god of language and reason. But also they think it was synthesized with a false cognate, har, emas. Har being the Hebrew word for mountain, and emas being related to emeth, the Hebrew word for truth. So the mountain of truth being Mount Sinai. And they're thinking, oh, we're interpreting what was given to us at Mount Sinai, the scriptures. So they're taking Hermes and har, emas, and that's where we get this word, apparently, hermeneutics, or the study of the scriptures. And there are principles by which you do hermeneutics, and we're going to get into our principles later on. Let's finish up these last two words. Exegesis. An exposition or explanation of a text. Again, originally it was just talking about a religious text. And eisegesis, an interpretation that reflects personal ideas or viewpoints of the interpreter. So these are kind of like two opposite sides of the same coin. Exegesis is looking at what's in the text, what's there. It's looking at the historical context. It's looking at the context of the verses around it, and trying to pull out of the text. That's why it has the Greek preface ex in there. It comes from ex and ago, which is, of course, the Greek word to drive, to lead, to go. So to lead out of a text, its meaning. And then eisegesis, it's the opposite. It's taking your own ideas and putting them into the text, superimposing them. It's taking assumptions and a priori commitments and saying, okay, well, these have to be true, and this text, the scriptures, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt that they're true, and so let's synthesize these things. That's closer to what eisegesis is. So we're all going to have different hermeneutical principles, because we're going to have different goals in these diatessaronds that we make. So let me tell you what my goals are going to be, and then I want to hear what you guys plan to do. For me, I want to make a children's Bible for my son. I've looked at a lot of different children's Bibles, and they are objectively terrible. Now, I want my son, first of all, to be a polyglot, specifically with Greek and Latin in his repertoire. I want him to be a native speaker. And so, from an early age, I want him, interacting with Greek and Latin. And that's why I'm having this interlinear, children's Bible that I'm making for him. Another thing is I have, some religious views that are primarily based on natural theology, what we can know about God through reason, through observation. And so there is going to be a certain amount of eisegesis in what I do. There's going to be me taking those beliefs like, Christian Platonism and reading them into the text to see if they do work. If they don't, obviously I have to say, okay, either the text, the scriptures are in error here, which I don't want to do. I believe in the inspiration of scriptures. Or I have to assume I'm wrong and go back and see, okay, did I make an error in my reasoning or whatnot? And the third principle that I'm operating on is advanced, precise, technical language. Like, a lot of the times when people are translating the scriptures, they're looking at the etymological history of the words, and they're basing their translation on that. Famous example: faith, hope, and charity. Why were they translating it as charity in the King James? Because in the Latin that they were translating from the Vulgate, it's caritas. That's how they translate agape, from the Greek to the Latin, agape to caritas, and then caritas, they translate, that's where we get our word charity, so let's translate it charity. Well, obviously, I don't think charity really communicates what agape is in the Greek, so I'm going to be a little bit more precise in what words I use, and I'm going to be very clear on what definition I have when I'm using them. That's the thing about translation in languages. No two languages have words that perfectly sync up. Lewis, he has the 4 loves, that book. Why? Because in Greek, there are 4 words for love. In English, we have the one that kind of covers them all. And, of course, then in English, you can get all to these qualifying words like sacrificial love or paternal love or brotherly love, whereas those would be just one word in English or in Greek instead of 2. And so languages don't match up. And are you familiar with the New American Standard Bible?
Yes. I've read some of it.
Okay. Their principle of hermeneutic was one-to-one translation. If there is a word in the Greek, you always translate it the same way in the English, even if the context demands something different.
There are multiple translations that opt on that principle.
Yeah, and I think it's a wrong hermeneutical principle, actually, because, it discounts things like homophones and whatnot and multiple definitions of a word, like cleave. When Jesus, says to Mary Magdalene in the garden, do not cleave to me, he's obviously saying, do not cling to me, don't, hold on to me. But cleave can have the exact opposite definition, to cut apart, to separate. And so if you're trying to do this one-to-one correspondence of words, I think you're kind of missing the art and difficulty and subtlety of translation.
No, exactly. Interface is always never perfect. Some words have much worse interfaces. Like, for instance, the Greek word day, which is some kind of degree conjunction between and but, and we can only translate it as either one of them depending on the context. As far as translations through multiple languages, obviously another probably more notable example from Latin to English is the Latin verbum, as in verbum caro factum est, the word made flesh. Literally in Latin becomes that in English, while as the Greek comes from logos, which is a much more sophisticated word, which is, I think, part of our first translation will be translating the beginning of John.
Trust me, when we get into that next week, logos is going to take up a good deal of time. You and I have had long discussions in the car on the word logos.
I think we have.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to hear, I know this question is just being put to you for the first time. How would you go about translating? What are some of the principles you would want to operate under?
Well, like I said, I kind of have an interest in seeing the interface. Obviously, the Greeks meant completely different things than we do. Even as far as agape, it doesn't quite match up to kind of ideas of love we have in English, which is probably due to influences from Romanticism coming out of the late Middle Ages, the early Renaissance.
Exactly.
Like how even Philos, as we translate philosophy, is the love of wisdom. Philos is more like the French M, which is more like, but can also be used to the extent of love, although it's the same word. And the Greeks never quite get to the kind of romantic loves we have. Eros is kind of close, but the interface is something that's interesting to look at. Just the discovery of how this language works and the way they think about things is kind of what I'm interested in. And to see what I can pull from that, just from the text and the context. And, like, for instance, why does Socrates in Plato's Apology, when asked how he should be punished, say, feed me at public expense? Was he just being cheeky? or was he saying something in a different way? It's interesting.
Okay, so it sounds much more exegetical, a lot less eisegesis on your part. Just trying to pull out the precise meaning of the text. Am I getting that right?
Precision, obviously. Yeah, I suppose precision is far from the exact word-for-word translation that we try to do. It takes up a lot more time and explanation. But I think that is what I'm trying to accomplish. I'm not that interested in placing theology over consistency.
Yeah. And I know we've been talking mostly on diction, but syntax this applies to as well because, grammatically languages are very different. So the word order of our translation might actually be very different than the original word order of the Greek or the Latin. I haven't decided yet how much I want to preserve things like word order and whatnot.
Okay.
So, something to think about. Sid, any thoughts off the top of your head?
Well, I'm not really... I'll be learning throughout this whole process. And, hopefully with the help of Matt and Greg, I can, do a good job. I haven't really studied, like I said at the beginning, Greek. So this will be kind of my first delve into it. Certain ideas that I hope to express are ideas that are expressed by the earliest of Christians. So if my translation gives to an understanding that is not shared by the majority of Christians in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, then I would rather not give for that interpretation. But that's, I guess, a kind of eisegesis based on my tradition. I guess that's what.
But it's actually a very common hermeneutical principle, and it's why you see sometimes the Greek word presbyters translated as elders. Other times you see it translated as priests. Another one is not ecclesia. I'm trying to think of the Greek word. Help me out here for bishop. The bishopric.
It's related
Episcopos.
Episcopos. Yeah, okay.
Yes. Sometimes that's translated as overseer in very low churches, whereas a Catholic translator will translate it as bishop, and that's taking things like tradition and imposing them. And so if you are a Congregationalist translating, you're going to definitely not want to use that word bishop. For
I mean, etymologically, bishop means the same thing. Overseers, the scope.
But it has connotation in our, world.
Exactly, the connotation.
And so what I hope to do is say, okay, well, what did they think an overseer was? Did they have this concept of a Congregationalist overseer in the early church? If they did, then yes, it would be right to translate it as overseer, considering the connotations given to it by modern society. But if it didn't, and if it had more of a connotation of what a Catholic would say would be bishop, or an Orthodox would say bishop, then I would most likely give it that translation.
Right. And that's when things really get interesting, when you combine all these principles, or not principles, all these areas of study: exegetical theology, practical theology, systematic theology, historical theology, and get a coherent worldview out of them. My producer Greg tells me we're kind of running out of time here. I would have loved to have gotten to talk about ecclesiology and all of our thoughts. We're going to have to put that off to next time, I guess. So let's just leave you with where you can reach us at. We do have a Facebook group. It is Facebook/groups/ratioatrutgers. That's actual at the word, not the little at sign like we use in our logo. And then we're also going to have an email address that you can reach us at, ratioatrutgers@gmail.com. Again, at is spelled out because you can't have the two at symbols in an email address, as annoying as that is. And yeah, we're definitely going to be wanting to respond to listener feedback if we get any. We'll answer any questions. We'll take many criticisms, I'm sure, because I'm sure there's something that we said that was inaccurate or whatnot. And I want us to also become a bit more conversational of a podcast. this has been a very formal one, surprisingly. I listen to a lot of podcasts myself, and it's a lot more relaxed. We're going to have a lot more production value in the coming weeks. We'll have actual music. We'll have transitions, hopefully. More than one microphone. So stick with us. This is our first episode, but I think we're going to really create something special here. So any closing thoughts?
No. I think we've done a good job. Hopefully the sound quality is okay. We'll have to check on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.